We will be looking here at the still life promised in the previous presentation. A series of fixations are established in one painting in an attempt to understand how we might build an impression of phenomenal field with extents that lie beyond the confines of visual field. We can suggest what this indicates for our developing understanding of visual perception and the human umwelt, the environment of our inner world and its relationship with the real. From this we start to see that vision is essentially self-reference in relation to the real. A full list of presentations appears at the end. As a brief recap, we established that our phenomenon of vision is entirely non-photographically rendered, and that visual field is a composite reliant on an explicit data set in macular or central vision, where we contemplate form, and an independent implicit data set, providing us with our primary sense of orientation in space, in what is currently envisaged as peripheral vision. We also looked at how eye, head and torso movements cover a 360-degree view of the environment in all directions without moving our feet, these forming the extents of phenomenal field. Our body movements then feeding vital information relating to our orientation with respect to phenomenal field back to the brain. I think it's possible to envisage this field as a series of nested 2D ellipses. If you remember from the third presentation, we required a primary presentation of visual field with fixation on the plaster hands, together with 3 prior fixations providing supporting contributions from memory. Of course, the camera lens here provides only a rough indication of each experiential visual field, whereas the depicted extents of each visual field in the final painting are reasonably accurate in that they were all measured intuitively. I've artificially reduced the size of the black circle indicating the extent of phenomenal field set out by eye movements to reduce the size of the canvas required. This is a physical constraint relating to the studio ceiling height. I don't think it'll prove too distracting. Considered as a group and correctly set within the spatial extents defined by eye movements, they constitute phenomenal field. The rectangular canvas frame is irrelevant. It just holds the canvas. There aren't any frames in vision, and we're not interested in picture space devices, so try and ignore it. As above, I will use the term visual field to denote what's been observed in the present, and composite memory to denote the other fixations, recording aspects pertinent to past fixations. I should point out that contributions forming composite memory are not connected with retinal afterimages. We can then populate areas of the canvas covered only with contributions from contextual memory. Fixation in the principal visual field area is held on the plaster hands. We start and end the visual sequence with this fixation. I realise that a typical fixation track doesn't look like this, it's far more frenetic. Setting out the painting requires me to make a few assumptions, intuitive guesses really, that are to some extent guided by aesthetic and conceptual considerations that may turn out to be unrelated to experiential vision. As with all vision space paintings, we are at play here to investigate what works, to see what we can manifest, uncover and use in the ongoing process of investigation. First off, with respect to me being consciously aware of the 3 contributions made from memory while I look at the plaster hands, I conducted a simple test. I approached the still life viewing position, looking first down at my feet and then at the sheep's skull, where my feet, legs and shoulder are apparent or contained within the extents of that view. I then look up a bit to fixate on the plaster hands, where I lose sight of my body, apart from my nose of course. For 1 to 2 seconds after looking at the hands, I definitely keep seeing my body and feet that now lie outside the extents of visual field. This past impression then fades from consciousness as I continue to look at the fixation point. Even when faded entirely, I don't sense the absence of this impression in that I don't sense I have lost touch with the information it provided. Maybe this history remains subconsciously in play within phenomenal field. I have to say that it's far more difficult to appreciate this occurring either side of visual field, and this may be because our eyes cover so much of the horizontal scene that the facility is simply not called for. My hunch is, however, that phenomenal field is active and is merely updated by contributions from visual field. The speed of fade, together with our activity rate involving body movements, is likely to account for the frenetic nature of eye movements and fixation rate. It's important to point out that vision space suggests that we're not building models of the environment in the brain. We are not directly seeing it. The environment is not being transferred or represented to us. Instead, we form a relationship with the real, where the vital information about the environment is being presented to us in a way that best helps us interact with it, based on our intent in the world. Our impressions of the world are highly conditioned by our structure, including our biology. The world is seen in relation to our internal mechanisms that generate our umwelt. We need to understand these and what's actually involved in an act of observation. In vision space, the space within perceptual structure is always the same. It's not based on the environment, it's based around us, for us. We see everything in relation to, or in terms of, the perceptual structure through which we generate our presentations of vision. The principal structure is a spherical field around a locus, provisioning the realization of proximity cues, and it's what appears within this generated field that changes. This field has nothing to do with optical depth of field. If there is a frame of reference, it's us. It certainly doesn't take the form of a conceptual rectangle, framing a view delivered by the rectilinear propagation of light as optical projection. We perceive the world in relation to ourselves. What appears within the field are patterns of values. So we're not reading or storing projected pictures with high level of detail in memory. Instead, we're memorizing arrangements of values in terms of a structure that we are generating. It may be, for example, that we recognize patterns in just a small area of visual field that then triggers recall. If this initial association is productive, this could unfold to a more general recall or cascade, enriching our current state of awareness. Coding values and unfolding sequences of values in terms of our structure is likely to be far more efficient than coding entire picture-based data sets from innumerable environments and constantly flicking through them like a conceptual archive. It would be a bit slow, I think. It seems to me to be entirely impractical, if not implausible, that an infinite supply of pictures is somehow stored in the memory, from which we build models and maps of the environment. Maybe then head off and sift through the auditory library. Memory is not an extended Dropbox. It also doesn't fit with experience. I don't model environments that I inhabit, and neither do I in my paintings. They record the presentations of values appearing within a perceptual structure. Models and maps are conceptual in nature, and while they can help to support our navigation and comprehension of environment in ways that direct sensory perception cannot, they belong to a post-perceptual realm. It is possible, of course, that by looking at a map we might influence what we then see on an experiential basis. A map being a conceptualized model of the world could even bias what we subsequently glean from our perceptual processes. Just as prior thoughts about rabbits when walking across a field may encourage us to see a lump of mud as a rabbit until other information from the scene counteracts our initial interpretation. In contrast, virtual reality environments are modelled by instrumentation, developed from our conceptual understanding. So we should be anything other than surprised that our takeout from these scenarios is perceptually deficient in comparison to exposure to real settings. One is virtual and the other is experiential. Is vision space mapping perceptual structure? Well, no. It's defining the system whereby information about the real world presents. If you like, it's the blank paper, the medium. Then surely the world is being mapped to our perceptual medium. Well, no, again, experiential vision is a true phenomenon, a controlled hallucination with multiple factors in play, and all in a constant flux, being directed by mind. It's these factors that derive line, edge, and form, set within implicit spatial awareness that's centered around the perceiver. Vision happens to us. It's not reported. Vision is interpreted in terms of our perceptual structure, and this space belongs to the umwelt. It's not of the environment. Mapping is just not an appropriate concept to use in terms of the phenomenon of vision. In all the composite memory views depicted here, implicit spatial field is body-centered and not set out from the individual fixation points referred to in the intro. The body-centered layout to the field structure is, however, a genuine experiential scenario. If, for example, we're thinking about something abstract or concentrating on a sound, and as a result are not actively fixating within the scene, We adopt ourselves as the locus of the visual field. It's deployed in other scenarios like daydreaming. I selflessly researched this condition while out shopping with my family in what's called imaginatively the Mall, on the outskirts of Bristol. In these circumstances, proximity awareness around me remains active and operational while I'm freed up to consider something far more engaging, like going for a sail. In this state, we remain sensitive to anything that crouches upon us. If anyone or anything approaches me, it's attended to and detected through the implicit field. This triggers my attention, and I fixate, a procedure that returns me to the sad and less engaging reality of the Mall. I consider the body-centered locus to in fact be the default setting for the implicit field. In evolutionary terms, this probably came first, in that it takes an act of will and concentration, i.e. mind, as well as the right equipment in the form of a lens, small area sophisticated receptors, and explicit processing channel to establish a fixation. I'm adopting this default configuration of the field structure to depict composite memory, partially for convenience, to simplify the scenario for myself, the painter executing the work, but also for the benefit of the viewer of the finished painting. So would it also not be a convenient scenario for us in real life if phenomenal field performed in this way? If composite memory didn't share a single locus, the multiple individual field settings would be difficult to navigate and require multiple subconscious forms of attention to monitor simultaneously. If we look at this earlier painting, we can see the self-reference of my feet and legs appearing in visual field, but the actual fixation is on the base of the cup. In this new rendering, the contributions from memory are moving the group locus to my body, or more precisely my head as part of my body. So we can see that it's my shoulders that are referenced with the smallest marks. These increase in size as distance increases, down the arms and down to my feet. They also increase in size as they travel down from the desktop to the floor, as the countertop is closer to my head. An area of the adjacent canvas, seen on the right, is close to my head, so the marks are correspondingly small. From setting out this field structure, we can understand that proximity cues are distributed in accordance with distance from my head, and not from the fixation point established out in the scene. So we have the same spatial system, a graded field structure, in both the depiction of visual field and composite memory, but with different setting out points. The point being that if it helps me and the viewer of the work, then the chances are it helps us all make sense of the real setting on an experiential basis. We could then navigate the world in terms of the singular structure of phenomenal field. If so, then none of our current information display systems address the situation. As far as I'm aware, neuroscience doesn't either. While all of this is pure supposition at this point, if we develop the vision space system, we can then psychophysically test it alongside our capabilities when immersed within a real setting. We're going to have to speculate to accumulate. To further differentiate between the depictions of visual field and the rendition of composite memory, I adopt another technique developed when painting Mandela. I paint visual field in colour, but composite memory in just a tonal range. This again helps to contextualize the contributions from composite memory. Clearly, there are also going to be a host of inconsistencies in the depicted spatial values, designating visual field and composite memory. Here are a few. In fact, it's safe to say that if they align, this would just be mere coincidence. This is not problematic, just as it's not an issue that the vertical stitch adjoining right and left eye views cause misalignments within visual field. These offsets and jumps all occur within the phenomenon of vision. They provoke us to use them to generate saliency. If they were not there, we could not differentiate, and if this doesn't happen, then we can't actively use the information to derive the associated perceptual judgments. This is one of the big issues that media producers are just going to have to get used to. Just as the so-called deformations in visual art are showing us flashes of perceptual structure, the artifacts that appear in vision space media are acquired. They don't need resolving. The manicured, homogeneous renditions of photographic and cinematic media form a barrier to us generating more immersive media. To achieve this additional saliency, we must seek to model visual awareness and not the environment. We must look to the structure that forms the phenomenon. Fixations are perceptually organized, requiring the drawing of focus for explicit central vision, together with the organization of implicit field around the object in question. Two separate acts that require coordination. Data through either channel or pathway is in flow. Through this sequence, consider the left-hand mug and then compare with the right. Apologies for the clipping on the right-hand side. Perhaps we consider that the explicit or ventral pathway is responsible for the contemplation of form, requiring the modulation of available data sets, so can to some extent be considered to be abstracted from time now, and require a build process involving conceptual assessment. Awareness of the implicit field occurs in the present, in time now, as far as that is possible within the dorsal stream. Its presentations just occur to us without the requirement for a conceptual appraisal. We should think here in terms of individual values, firing independently as and when the brain has the information available for mind to set the field's locus. It's not difficult to think in terms of neuronal receptive fields here. While this would not be a direct one-to-one linkage, the value appearing and its relationship to its neighbours would be off the peg, so to speak. We should also understand that our appreciation of the depicted implicit field is not conducted through the dorsal stream again. This process is not recursive and we're not going to suffer from feedback. The screen is now an object in the environment, with the patterns established or pre-formed. I guess this is why animals aren't that interested in TV. For us, once conceptualized and articulated within the painting or visual media, the explicit conscious system can read the implicit cues with the forebrain, recognizing the structures and working with them. This isn't as daft as it may first seem. Conscious awareness, strongly connected to the explicit system, is aware that something is missing from the reality presented by optically structured media. This has led us to engineer with the explicit system to create binocular fusion technologies in an effort to break the 2D impasse, as opposed to challenge its ecology. The explicit system is effectively blind to implicit reality, as spatial awareness processing occurs in an entirely separate processing pathway and computational system from which it's excluded. Unfortunately, all of what I've outlined inevitably leads me to a position where I can't really help but sound either arrogant, flaky, or both. With respect to the study of vision, the position indicates that if research doesn't result with something that contributes to the fundamentals of vision space, either by supporting or adding value to it, then we have to ask, what is it that the research is actually addressing? Experiential vision or a concept of it, limited by the assumptions contained in the ontology of its approach? Is much of vision science held in a perpetual hall of mirrors, under the influence of optical projection and picture space, from which it can't escape? Is it safe to assume that we understand what's involved in an act of observation before we start to work with it, and subsequently move on to remote scales on the basis of instrumentation designed around that assumption? That simply doesn't float for me. I don't call that enlightenment, in the same way I don't think self-crowned realism has much to do with reality. Reality develops from our perceptual structure to form our umwelt. Vision is self-reference in relation to the real, and that is as good as it gets. As a postscript, I may as well own up to a drawing error within the composite memory area. This came about as I tried to work out what was happening in the extremity of visual field as I looked at the sheep's head. To help to resolve the issue, I moved my fixation to the under-counter wash basin and drew that situation as it occurred to me, as opposed to move back to the designated fixation point and draw the area with my knowledge of the scene in support. In vision, as in vision space, we set each eye view out on its respective side of visual field, affecting a splice down the centre in contravention of central perspective. So we now have diverging lines, indicating the presence of stereo information, where they should be monocular and therefore converging to a vanishing point. By the time I realised the error, there was a reasonable amount of paint applied to it, and I just couldn't be bothered to wipe it all off and make good and start again. And anyway, I think it's quite interesting, and if I wasn't trying to make clean and clear statements that others can follow with as little confusion as possible, I'd be doing this sort of thing deliberately. It reminds me of so many other paintings, especially this one by Van Gogh, where the left-hand chair leg is clearly referenced by information coming from the opposing eye. These recordings are not deformations, they're perceptually accurate. So on that basis, my drawing error is staying.